Okay, folks, good to see you again. Last time we were together, we talked about the Iron Century, which was actually more than a century. It took place 1540, 1660, and we mentioned about a number of things that were concerns at that time, economic concerns, particularly price revolution. Everything was expensive then, everything except silver, it seemed like. And then we also talked about religious matters, and we had some major problems between the Catholics and the Protestants. All right, we went through some of those engagements, the German religious wars. Cius Regio, Ius Religio, there, with the Peace of Augsburg. We also talked about the French Wars of Religion. And it took place over a number of years. You should be familiar with that. These wars that took place between the Protestants which were actually Calvinists, these Calvinists which were the Huguenots, and their unrelentless battles, if you will, with the Catholics there. You should be familiar with that event that took place on the 24th of August in 1572, which was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Be familiar with that of Henry IV. He was a good king, very jovial, well-liked individual, formerly known as Henry of Navarre. And I also mentioned that of the Edict of Nantes, which provided a limited amount of religious freedom, to the Huguenots. And we also mentioned that of the Dutch Wars with Spain. You should be familiar with such people as William the Silent, William of Nassau, what he was also known as, and William the First. And you need to recognize about Francis Drake, the Sea Dog. And see, with his Sea Dogs, that was his crew, by the way, plundering those Spanish ships. And we closed out the class period with that 1588 event, which was known as the Spirit, which was known as the defeat of the Invincible Armada, the Spanish Armada. Alrighty, folks, now with the Edict of Nantes, and with the end of the war between England and Spain, and the end of the war between the Netherlands and Spain, peace finally comes to that area. Now, this peace that will take place around the year 1609, but I have to tell you, good folks, it is not going to be for very long, because another war is going to break out, and it's going to be a devastating war, which is known as the 30 Years' War. It will last from 1618 until 1648. So let's go to my camera here, and we will go through this war. A lot of exciting things to talk about today. If I can keep my camera in place and not knock everything off of my desk here. And this is known as the 30 Years' War. Let me try to even it up for you good folks so you can see what it looks like here. And that's the way we spell it, and I gave you the proper dates for that. All right, so this is the 30 Years' War, and it does last 30 years, by the way. And it is a European war. And we have many, many nations that are involved in this. And I didn't pair it for the size because some of them just actually changed size for a while. But we also had Austria and Dutch, and that's the Netherlands. We had France that was involved in this. We had Spain, which was involved in this war. Germany, which Germany was not a nation at that time, but it's more of a series of provinces. Even Sweden gets into it. We don't think of Sweden as having a magnificent army, but they are going to carry the day in this war here. And then we also had England involved in it to some degree, and I probably won't mention England anymore following this. But anyway, some people refer to this as the German Civil War because that's where it takes place. Germany is going to be the battleground for this, the German Civil War. And it all began, and let's see if I wrote this down for you, and I did not. It all began not in Germany itself. You got to remember we had the Protestant Revolution, so we have Germany that's split. Germany is Lutherans. We also have Catholics that are in Germany. Likewise here, and I'll say it once again, that Germany is not a recognized country at that time because it's a series of various provinces. But where the war actually began was in Bohemia. Now, Bohemia today is where the Czech Republic is located. It's formerly known as Czechoslovakia, and it was controlled by the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs are Catholic. And much of that area of Bohemia had pulled away from Catholicism, and they were Protestants here. And so that's where the fighting actually began. And when German Catholics went into that area of Bohemia, it stirred up the Protestant Germans that were in Germany. So it ends up being Germany is a central battleground, even though that is not really the area that it actually began. And it was a terrible, terrible affair. Many of these German cities were ransacked 9 and 10 times. Some of these German cities lost 50% of its population. And it was just an absolute bloodfest with that. If you are inclined to read more on that subject, I wish you would do so. But largely no side was victorious at that point anyway. But entering into the focus, the nation I mentioned to you a little bit earlier is that of Sweden. And I didn't even write down the name Sweden, so you'll need to do that. You need to write this down as Sweden. And the king of Sweden is Gustavus II, also called Gustavus Adolphus. He has a nickname, Lion of the North. I want you to remember that name because you will absolutely see him again. He's like the George Washington to Sweden. Everybody recognizes him. If you get the opportunity to go to Sweden, it's a beautiful place here, folks. Everything's very, very expensive up in the in that area, in the Baltic area. But if you go to Stockholm, Sweden, right in the central Plaza Market Square, there's a huge statue there of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North. All right, neat place to visit if you can work it into your schedules to visit there. And let's see, we had an army, by the way, of 150,000. They were very well trained. I'll tell you some of the tactics in just a little bit. But you might look at that and think, well, that's not much of an army, not a large-sized army. But the average army during the period of time here in the 30 Years' War was an army of about 40,000. So you can do the math on that here, folks. For Gustavus Adolphus, he has an army that's much, much larger than that 40,000, 4 times the size of it anyway. And they engaged against the Catholic forces in such battles here, the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, and actually in that Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, his life was taken in that battle. All right, but it's going to swing the sides here, folks, over to the sides of the Protestants. All right, now, I want to spend a few minutes with this individual here, and we're not through with him today. And we'll talk about him again at another time. And I don't know what was the matter with me. I didn't write down his nationality either. But it's an individual by the name of Cardinal Richelieu. You probably look at the name and probably figure out the nationality, and he's French. So you'll need to write that in. This Cardinal Richelieu. He's a very, very influential religious individual, and from France, by the way, too. Now, this is a little bit muddy. I don't really understand it completely here. We got a lot of differing views on this. But it leads us to believe, historians lead us to believe, that Cardinal Richelieu actually paid for Sweden and with Gustavus Adolphus to get involved in this war. And you would wonder, why in the world would that take place? Why would France, who is Catholic, France is a Catholic country, why would they get involved in getting Sweden to be engaged in this war? And you have to take a look at the map behind me to fully appreciate this, folks, even though France is Catholic. But if we look at here at Spain, and Spain is Catholic, but it's controlled by the Habsburgs here. And if we have this area over here, which is Austrian Habsburgs, it is also Catholic here. And if Austria and the Habsburgs win over Germany, then France is literally surrounded in every direction here. It is, to include the Netherlands, it is surrounded by the Catholic Habsburg. So there's some good philosophy behind this, good deep thinking behind it, that actually Cardinal Richelieu was paying Gustavus Adolphus with his superior army to come in on the side of the Protestants here to prevent the Habsburgs from winning it. And I kind of go along with that. I honestly do. All right, so anyway, let's go back to my camera here, and we're going to bring this war to a close. Finally, level heads prevail in this war, and we're going to bring this war to a close on my birthday, by the way, on the 30th of January 1648. This treaty was known as the Treaty of, look at the word here, the Treaty of Westphalia. Treaty of Westphalia. Obviously, I was not born in 1648, but my birthday is the 30th of January, so I've got a birthday coming up pretty soon. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. You can probably look at me on the camera and get a pretty good guess of that, too. All right, now let's work on our pronunciation here, folks. All right, in German, the W's are always pronounced as V's, so Westphalia. All right, with our A pronunciation, we make it a long A, pronunciation such as that, and kind of draw it out a little bit. Westphalia. All right, that'll be one of your examination questions. I don't hold you responsible for dates, but I do hold you responsible here for identification of treaty names. Okay, so let me interrupt myself just a little bit here and tell you a little bit about some of the tactics and weaponry that we had in this very brutal war here. We'll change my sheet here. And let's go through these tactics, weapons and tactics. If I can get it up here where you can read it anyway, Weapons and Tactics of the 30 Years' War. And in this type of warfare, if you had me last semester, we spent some time talking about like hoplite soldiers and the phalanx, and we went through Roman formations. And so we're going to do the same thing here in the 30 Years' War. But in this war, they used large masses of infantry. And these infantry were organized into squares. All right, and I tried to illustrate it for you, let you get an appreciation for this. Now, most of these armies are about 40,000 in size here. And we'll just say, for example, here that this is one square here, and we have squares of soldiers here. We have another square here, and there's about 3,000 soldiers, or 3,000 soldiers, can't read my writing, 3,000 soldiers in each one of those squares. Now, what they're armed with, they have pikes. You understand what I'm talking about with this? Long spears, but it's also interspersed with musketeers, individuals that have muskets here. So we have, like a pikeman, a musketeer, a pikeman, a musketeer, and it just makes cavalry charges just virtually impossible. It's a formation that's very difficult to defeat there. Okay, so you also had, like I said, we had muskets at the time, which I don't have a photograph of, and there were also cannons. I took this photograph in some museum, some castle in Germany, I believe it was anyway, which was an actual cannon that came from that period of time, from the 30 Years' War. All right, so anyway, kind of interesting with that too. And like I said, the armies were about 40,000. And here was something that was unique, and this was perfected by Gustavus Adolphus. And I need to go back up here so you can kind of visualize this. And what it was referred to as is called a salvo or volley fire. Some of you are probably familiar with that. You know what I'm talking about with that. And that means rather than an individual here firing the musket individually, the individuals here, all the individuals, will fire their muskets on command. So what it creates is a huge shock and awe. You get a blast of lead, and we get a blast of gun smoke, powder going into the atmosphere with that too. All right, so that's referred to as a salvo, and of course we use that effectively today in our modern army here. Now, the type of uniform that they had, or type of armor that they had brass helmets. They also wore brass body armor. And this body armor would cover your thorax, it would cover your abdomen, it would cover your thorax, it would also cover your upper arms, it would cover your your upper legs. But the lower arms and the lower legs were bare. They were bare and they were not covered in armor. And I just happened to run across this likeness here. This is a person we've talked about before, who was Philip II, Felipe II, who was the king of king of Spain, and he's wearing a uniform that is indicative of that time here of this 30 Years' War. All right, you can see the brass armor there, covering the upper arms and covering the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. All right, so anyway, that is the 30 Years' War here. Okay, so let's move on here and let's see what else we have in store for us today here. All righty, now, as a result of this war, the premier nation to develop was that of France. France, I didn't mention this to you earlier, but France had defeated Spain in a battle of Rocroi, and that was just something that just did not happen. France does not defeat Spain on the battlefield. But anyway, at the end of the war, it was France that was served to be the premier nation in Europe, and they will maintain that position for a long period of time here. Now, what we'll see is that the former premier nation in Europe, Spain will suffer a decline. The silver mines in Potosi had been drained. In other words, the silver had been depleted in those mines there. Spain had been a very wealthy country, and of course it was ravaged with inflation. And when the silver quantities panned out, so to speak, it caused Spain to just literally go into a depression with this. During the good times for Spain, they never industrialized, they never developed their agricultural resources here. And Spain's going to be on the decline. It will be France. It will be the premier nation. So let's go back to France here, and I want to revisit this individual, Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, in my estimation, was a true ruler of France. After we had the death of Henry IV. He'll be followed by his son who is Louis XIII. And Louis XIII, we've got a couple of things to mention with him in the next lecture or two about Louis XIII, but not a remarkable individual, and he just did not stand out here. Rather weak king, and like I wrote here, the true ruler of France during this period of time of Louis XIII was that Cardinal Richelieu. So I need you to remember Cardinal Richelieu. Thought I had a likeness of him around, but I can't just put my finger on it right this second here. Okay, so let's go back to England. We're going to spend quite a bit of time here talking about England. In fact, the majority of the remaining portion of the class period will be with England. And last time we left this, Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, good Queen Bess, Gloriana sometimes referred to, she died in 1603. She had no children. Like I said, Virgin Queen, she never married, no children. And that is the end of the line for the Tudors. Now, she was a Tudor. Her father was Henry VIII, as you well know. We've been through that on several occasions. But there's nobody in the Tudor lineage there. So what you have to do under the rules of the lineage and royalty, you have to find the closest relative. And where they did so, this was the Stuart family. It was a Stuart family. They were from Scotland. Scotland, of course, is in the northern part of the United Kingdom as we recognize it today. And the closest relative to Elizabeth was that of James I. Now, James I was actually the King of Scotland, and he was known as James VI of Scotland. James VI of Scotland. But now, by becoming the King of England, he's King of Scotland too, but by becoming the King of England, he now takes the title James I. His reign will be from 1603 to 1625. If you get the opportunity to go to Scotland, and I always like Scotland. Scotland's a wonderful place. Much of my ancestry comes from Scotland and Ireland. And but if you get a chance to go to Scotland, you'll certainly want to visit the town there called Edinburgh. And if you go to Edinburgh, and you'll see on the hill that's right above the town itself, you'll find Edinburgh Castle. And you'll want to make your visit up there. It's kind of in ruins in some parts, but some of it's still very well restored. And if you make the tour and you're going through, and I now recommend that you go take a self-guided tour. You don't have to have a tour leader. And if you go through the tour, you'll pass through a room. It's not much larger than, well, it's about the size of one of our faculty offices, not very large at all. And that's where James I was born. He was born there, and I don't remember the exact date that he was born. His mother was Mary Queen of Scots, and here she is right here. You've probably heard of her before, Mary Queen of Scots. She was not the Queen of England. She was not she was certainly not the Queen of England, but she was the mother of James I. And you can actually go into that very room in which she was born. And a neat occurrence there. She had no love lost between she and Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth did not care for her at all, and in fact, Queen Elizabeth, and I tell my class this face to face, Queen Elizabeth scheduled her to be beheaded. And the way the stories go, anyway, when they brought Mary Queen of Scots out to cut off her head, and she had a full skirt on, and it looks like she was kind of wobbling when she was walking, and when they bent her over to cut her head off, they did do so and cut her head off, and a little puppy scampered out from beneath the skirt there and went running off. And supposedly, the way the stories I always heard it was, is that she had the puppy between her legs, and she was holding it there between her legs, and once they cut her head off, of course, the puppy just was released. So anyway, kind of an interesting story. Nonetheless. So let's go back to our camera here, James I. I don't have a likeness of James I, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to show you one of his sons shortly, and he looked just like his son because the artists that paint all these royalty portraits paint all of the men to look exactly the same. And so anyway, some people refer to him, in fact, it was Henry IV, the King of France, referred to James I as the wisest fool in Christendom. Homely but vain, adult but erudite. You can figure those words out yourself here. The wisest fool in Christendom, homely but vain. In other words, he thought he was very good looking here. Adult but erudite. He thought he was very well educated, but he wasn't real smart. All right, and one of the problems that he had, he didn't appeal to the people very much here. He did a number of things here. He allowed monopolies to form here in England itself. Allowed monopolies to form. He everybody for special privileges. He would levy unfair taxes upon the people here without the approval of Parliament. He refused to engage in wars, and by doing so, this made him look very weak in the eyes of the people here. Now, the problem with James I was he was always having problems with this group, and this group which actually controlled Parliament, and this group was known as the Puritans. Now, I think I mentioned this to you. I know I did last semester anyway, but the Puritans are Calvinists. Now, let's stop and think about this for a second. We have a handful of Catholics that are in England, and the majority of the people in England are Anglicans. They're Church of England. Church of England is the Anglicans. We have a small number of that which are that of Catholic. And then we have those that are Calvinists. And these Calvinists are Puritans. And what they wish to do is, and that Puritan actually translates to mean purify. They want to purify the church of anything that is Catholic. And what these Puritans felt like, they felt like the Church of England was too closely identified, too closely associated with that of Catholicism. And as a matter of fact, it was. The services for the Anglican Church were very similar to that, of the Catholic Church, other than you did not send money off to the Vatican. All right, so that's where the problem was. The Puritans controlled Parliament. Okay, so James I died peacefully in his sleep in 1525. Let's move on down here. My camera is not cooperating with me, folks, here. And let's see if I can get this right here. And so Charles I now becomes king, 1625, 1649. There's a likeness of him in your textbook, if you follow along in your textbook. Here's a likeness of Charles I right here, and that's exactly the way that James I would look. And that's exactly the way that Charles II and James II, they're all going to look the same, like I told you. The artists paint all of these males to resemble each other with that. All right, so anyway, and that's Charles I. We'll come back to Charles I very shortly here. And for Charles I, he wasn't any better than his dad. And he never got along with Parliament very well, never got along with the Puritans very well whatsoever here. He entered into a war with France, which was different than his dad did. And the Puritans passed in Parliament, passed the Petition of Right in 1628, which declared that all taxes not voted and approved by Parliament were illegal taxes with that. So there's a problem here with Charles I and Parliament. And so in 1629, Charles I dismissed Parliament, sent them home. Charles I dismissed Parliament for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640. That would be like the President of the United States, here folks, President of the United States, dismissing the Senate, dismissing the House of Representatives, telling them to go home, and I don't need you again for 11 years. All right, now, that's something certainly that didn't sit very well with Parliament and the Puritans or the people in England here. All right, so finally, what Charles I did, Charles I, the way it goes, we'll go back to me here, folks. Charles I tried to force the Anglican Book of Common Prayer upon Presbyterian Scotland. And the Scots did not take this lightly, and they organized an army, and it looked like England was going to be threatened with this. Combined with this, we had some Catholic Irish that went into rebellion in English-controlled Ireland. And so this presented a problem. And so what Charles I had to do, he had no other alternative except he had to call back into session Parliament. And Parliament, certainly controlled by the Puritans here, were called back in session, and immediately they passed a law saying the king could not dissolve Parliament ever again, and the king could not levy unjust taxes upon the English people itself. All right, so with this, Charles I called forth his private guard to go into the Houses of Parliament and arrest those Puritan agitators who were present there. And those Puritan agitators, the leaders of Parliament, were able to escape from that. And with this, we're going to find that two sides here, those that support the king and those that support Parliament and the Puritans, are going to break apart such that. And what this is going to do, it's going to bring forth a war. So let's go back to my camera here, and we will go into this war. And I need you to spend quite a bit of time with this, folks. A lot of good material here on the worst civil war in English history, and it is referred to as the English Civil War. the English Civil War. You can write the dates down there, 1642, 1649. It is the English Civil War. All right, now I cannot tell you where it took place in England because it largely took place all over England. All right, I think there's a video provided for your purposes here in understanding that. All right, now there are two sides that we'll break forth here, and I want you to know this. You need to recognize Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are supporters of the king. They are the aristocrats. They're high church Anglican. These are owners of large tracts of land. For the Cavaliers, these are the wealthy individuals. These are the wealthy individuals. And then we have the regular people. And the regular people here refer to themselves as the Roundheads. They are supported by Parliament, the Puritans, owners of small tracts of land, just the average individual. The average individual may not have a whole lot of money here, too. All right, so understand the difference between these two sides that are going to be fighting in this war. We had the Cavaliers and you had the Roundheads. Now, the Roundheads are given their names because they have short haircuts. They have short haircuts. Now, with the Cavaliers have powdered wigs. They had the frosted wigs, the powdered wigs. They dress in the attire of the royalty, the aristocrat. And for the Roundheads, they have short haircuts. Short haircuts. So, I would point out to some of you in class, I would say you would probably be a Roundhead, and whatever the case is. All right, now, at first, the King's Army, when I say the King's Army, the Cavaliers are almost always victorious. But after a couple of years, the Roundheads started winning more of the battles here, too. All right, they weren't defeated, but they could not gain victory here. But finally here, folks, in 1646, the Roundheads gained the upper hand. They honestly did. They gained the upper hand, and the King's side, the Cavaliers, surrendered. And that was in 1646, and they surrendered. Well, everything should have stopped right there. The king would have remained in place, everything would have settled down, and we would have gone back to business as usual. But then the Roundheads started bickering amongst each other. They were led by a person by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And there's a likeness of him in your textbook, showing, I think it's a coin anyway, and I'll show you a photograph of Cromwell in just a little bit. And anyway, so the Roundheads began to bicker amongst each other. And for Charles I, when we talk about Charles II before you know it, and James II before you know it too. And for Charles I, he took this as a sign of weakness. And he made the worst mistake of his life. He restarted the war. So the war starts again here between the Cavaliers supporting the king and the Roundheads, which are led by Oliver Cromwell. So it was at this point where Cromwell made the statement, "I will cut off the king's head with a crown attached to it." That's quite a boast to make right there. Let's see if it's going to take place. So I'm going to go back to my camera, and here we go. And did I write out Cromwell's name? I surely did here. Lord Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell. All right, so anyway, the war dragged on for about another year, and then finally the king's side, the Cavaliers, they actually surrendered for a second time. And that's when Charles I was taken into custody. All right, he surrendered first in 1646. Let me get myself back on track right here. And he was taken into custody, and he was tried for treason against England. Is there any doubt in anybody's mind will he be found guilty of committing treason against England? Oh, absolutely. He surely will here, folks. And so anyway, on this date here, on the 30th of January, my birthday, by the way, my birthday in 1649, Charles I was taken in outside of where not where Buckingham Palace is, outside where the Houses of Parliament are today. And in fact, it's right across the street from number 10 Downing Street. And right there, that's where the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, resides today anyway. And they brought the king out, Charles I, to behead the man. And somebody had taken the axe away. And so that caused a little bit of stir there. They had to wait around for somebody to ride over to the Tower of London and get a different axe and bring that back. And I imagine that took about an hour or so to do so. And I can only imagine the situation with Charles I. He was probably having some severe gastrointestinal problems, if you understand what I'm talking about there, waiting for the axe to arrive. And sure enough, they cut his head off, folks. And they honestly did. They removed his head. So who becomes the leader here of Great Britain? It will be Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell will pick up the title there of Lord Protector. All right, so anyway, and that was that. So I will tell you right now that life under Cromwell was not very pleasant in England. Cromwell was a Puritan. He was a very, very devout Puritan. It was a stark way of living there. It was a lot of restrictions placed upon the people. They were trying to force Puritanism, throughout the British Kingdom and also in Ireland. Ireland was mostly Catholic. Today, I'm not kidding you, even today, and that was in 1649, but even today, when you travel to Ireland, you see all of the desecration of some of those Catholic churches that was done by Cromwell and his henchmen. I mean, you'll pass by a very beautiful cathedral, and you'll find heads knocked off of statues. They place the statues outside the church, usually in the windows of the church, and the heads will be knocked off, the arms will be knocked off, legs knocked off. And you think, whoa, what happened here? What kind of sick person would do that? And it all came from Cromwell. It came from Cromwell and his Puritan forces that went through that area. And I'm not making that up. That actually is that. So many people did not care for Cromwell at all. Cromwell died, I think it was in 1658, and he was buried. He was placed in, I think it was in Westminster Abbey, I believe it was, anyway, and buried there. And I'm going to come back to the story in just a second here, folks. And then when Cromwell died in 1658, he'll be followed by his son, Robert Cromwell, and he was not any more popular than his dad. And when he died in 1660, England was ready for the royalty to return, and sure enough, the son of Charles I will assume the role, and his name is Charles II. All right, so we'll go back to my camera for just a brief point here, folks. And we now have Charles II. Charles II is likewise a Stuart. The original spelling of that name, Stuart, was S-T-E-W-A-R-T, but the family has spent time in France, and there's no W in the French alphabet, so the name was corrupted to S-T-U-A-R-T, and that's the way we recognize it as today. Charles II will reign from 1660 1685. I'm not going to tell you anything about Charles II now, other than tell you many people refer to him as the enemy of virginity and chastity. Enemy of virginity and chastity. Had no royal offspring, had plenty of unroyal offspring, if you understand what I'm talking about with that. As he put it, I did not wish to resume my travels. He had been placed in exile during the English Civil War, or right after the English Civil War, during the times of Cromwell, and he wanted to come back, wanted to leave his places of exile there. All right, so anyway, that's Charles II, the enemy of virginity and chastity. More on him at a later time here. Now, let me tell you something here about, and before I do this, I want to refresh your memory on what Charles I looks like, and then I want to show you a statue here of Cromwell. Now, this statue of Cromwell, which is right here, is right outside the Houses of Parliament. And I'm going to just leave that on here and come back to it in just a few seconds here. All right. But Cromwell was so disliked that I think it was in 1661 that his body was exhumed. And when his body was exhumed, taken from the ground here, the people so detested Cromwell that they actually hanged the man. They hanged this man. And this was done on January the 30th, my birthday in 1661, by the way. I hope you folks remember my birthday. All right, and they hanged the man. Now, why in the world would you hang a person that's already died? And then the story gets even a little bit deeper than this. According to the tour guides when you're present in London there, Cromwell was so despised that they kept him hanging from the noose there for several days, and then they cut the noose and then drawed and quartered the body. They cut his head off and then cut his body into 4 different sections and spread them to the 4 different parts of England. Some people will tell you that that is not a true story, but tour guides will avow that it is honestly a true story. Now, I want to go back to my photographs here of Cromwell here, and also of Charles I. Now, you probably wouldn't think anything about this when you're standing there outside the Houses of Parliament and you're looking at Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell here, and you see the statue. All right, you don't think anything about that whatsoever. And then until somebody tells you so, they'll say, look across the street. And when you look across the street, you see a statue there of Charles I. Now, there are people that have sick minds here, my friends, but what somebody has done with this, they took Cromwell and put Cromwell here, and they took Charles I, the statues here, and they faced the statues toward each other, across the street from each other, so forever and forever, Cromwell and Charles I will stare for eternity at each other. Anyway, and that's kind of crazy with that. All right. But anyway, let's move on here. We'll go back. I'm almost through for the day here, but I want to mention to you about a hysteria that spread through Europe during these times that we're talking about, and that was witchcraft. That was witchcraft. Let me get my camera adjusted just right here. And witchcraft. Now, people of these times recognized two different types of magic. They recognized a type of magic which was called white magic. When I was about your age, for most of your ages anyway, there was a popular song that was called "Do You Believe in Magic?" It was done by the Loving Spoonful, by the way. And anyway, popular song. So I'm asking you, do you believe in magic? Now, what most Europeans accepted at that time was white magic. They had no issue with this whatsoever. White magic, that is healing, fortune telling, palm reading, finding lost objects. There's no problem with this. But where people had the problem was with black magic, and people believed in black magic here. Now, black magic is witchcraft. It's the devil. It's Satan. And by the time that we've been talking about here in the 15th, 16th century, people firmly believed in the powers of Satan. They honestly believed in that. And this is where the problem comes with this, at black magic. So what we're going to see here in a period here in England and in Europe, I mean to say, it's throughout Europe and in England, we get what is known as witch hunts to take place. It's going to last largely from 1580 to 1660 here. These are the witch hunts here. And it's going to usually be, I'm going to shift away, I want to find a photograph here. I hate to leave you like that, but I want to show you a photograph. And this was what you would find in many of these European villages here, where people believed in these old hags like the Baba Yaga or some gnome here that would have some kind of mystical witchcraft or wizardcraft abilities here. And so people strongly believed in that. And if you travel throughout Europe today, you'll find that most communities, or many of these communities, will still have likenesses of these old figures, such as what you're seeing right here. But nonetheless, what we'll see here in this period of time is witchcraft and witch hunts here. And the church itself will organize inquisitors to use all means at their disposal to force a confession from these witches. And you'll be surprised what will happen here, folks, when you take lighted embers, like charcoal, and you place it against the heels to an individual there, you'll get a confession of that individual. If you place enough weight and stones upon an individual's thoracic cavity, you'll get a confession from them. And that's what would take place with here, too. They would just pile these stones upon individuals to such a degree that literally the bone marrow would seep. It would ooze out of the skin itself, ooze out of the bones, Alrighty, and the amazing thing about it is it will come to a close here in England and in Europe, but crazily enough, it will spread over to what will later be the United States. And you're probably familiar with that, with the Salem witch trials that will take place about 100 years later, around 1680, 1692. Alrighty here, folks, that puts us in a pretty good position here for stopping. I'm going for about 38 minutes here. When we come back, we're going to take a look at the cultural aspects in Europe here, particularly that in England, a few other places here, France too. And then we're going to get into an interesting section called absolutism. You don't know what I'm talking about right now, but you'll get very comfortable with that before we get through with a couple of lectures that we have with absolutism. Okay, thank you very much.